what I want to do is I want to go back quite a ways into the United States Senate. There was a debate many years ago in the United States Senate on partial birth abortion. This is Senator Sam Brownback of Kansas. Now, he was the senator at the time. After that, he became the governor of Kansas. And recently, 2018, he became the head, let me get his exact title. It's the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom in the State Department. So this is the first time the State Department has set up an ambassador to ensure religious freedom takes place around the world to the best of the State Department's ability. In fact, I was privileged to do a Bible study via phone a few weeks ago, and he was on it because it was with the State Department. And so he is a solid believer. And what he did in this debate back in 2003 was he showed a photograph of a 21-week-old fetus he said had been spared abortion by doctors who operated on the womb to correct a birth defect. And he showed a picture in the United States Senate. This is the picture he showed. You see the hand here grasping the doctor's finger as they're about to operate in the womb at 21 weeks. Here's a better picture. As you can see, the arm coming out of the womb and the doctor holding the arm. So he shows this in the United States Senate, and he says this to Senator Barbara Boxer. At that time, she was the senator in California. He says, is little Samuel's hand the hand of a person, or is it the hand of a piece of property? And here's what Barbara Boxer said. I am not a doctor and I am not God. I trust other human beings to make these decisions. Now, question, do you have to be a doctor or do you have to be God to know that that's a human being? No, and she says, I trust other human beings to make these decisions. What is a United States Senator supposed to do? The United States Senator is supposed to make law. That's what they do. They're lawmakers. They make decisions related to issues like this, especially when it comes to life and death. Does Jesus trump your politics? We're going to try and do three things. First thing we're going to talk about is, should Christians be involved in politics? Because quite frequently you hear people say, no, Christians should not be involved in politics. We should just preach the gospel and get people saved, and that'll take care of all of our political issues. That's what they say anyway. Secondly, what are the most important issues in politics that Christians ought to be concerned with? In fact, I think everybody ought to be concerned with. And then finally, we're going to deal with this abortion issue. Does abortion trump everything else? Because many Christians will say, yeah, abortion trumps everything else. And other Christians are going to go, no, it's an important issue, but there are other pro-life issues, like the environment, like poverty, like racism. So let's start right here at point one. Should Christians be involved in politics? Now, whenever people say they shouldn't, that Christians ought not be involved in politics, I just ask them to get out their iPhone, and I give them a word to type into Google, and this is the picture that comes up. What is this? This is the Korean Peninsula. There's the 38th parallel. As you know, we fought a war over that. Here's South Korea. It's filled with light. It's filled with freedom. It's one of the more Christianized countries in the world. It is prosperous, as you can see. North Korea, on the other hand, is a concentration camp. There's one major reason for the difference between South and North Korea. And don't say electricity. I know that's part of it, but no. What's the major reason for the difference between South and North Korea? Politics, right? The South has political freedom and the North does not. Politics is the reason there's such a stark difference between a peninsula where you have a homogeneous population of Koreans. Now, my only question is, for people who say we ought not get involved in politics, whether you're a Christian or not, is, would you rather live in North Korea or South Korea? Quite obviously, you'd rather live in South Korea because politically they have it better than North Korea. In fact, if you think about this, politics affects almost everything that you do. Politics affects your church, your family, your health, your money, your business, your freedom, your property, your school, your home, your safety, evangelism, the poor, the unborn. Everyone and everything is affected by politics. Right now we're standing in a church building. Just to build a building like this, they just put an extension on over here. Beautiful extension. Politically, they had to go through all sorts of hoops in order to be able to build that, didn't they? For good reason. You want to build a safe building, obviously. There are zoning laws and construction laws. I mean, just to build a building, you got to get involved in politics. Now, you notice here, I have evangelism here. Why do I have how does politics affect evangelism? Yes, can you preach the gospel legally in North Korea? No, of course you can't. In fact, if you don't think politics are important to evangelism and to living out the Christian faith, you haven't been to some of the countries I've been to. I've been to Iran. I've been to Saudi Arabia. I've been to China. You can't do what we're doing in this room right now and over the airwaves right now in those countries. Why not? Not legally anyway, because politically they've ruled it out. Now, we just take it for granted here in America. We just think, oh, this is the way it is everywhere. No, it's not. It is not this way everywhere. We are the exception. You've heard of American exceptionalism? Doesn't mean Americans are better than anyone else. It means our founding documents are better than any other founding documents. It means our system of government is better than any other. We have these rights embedded in our Constitution. Most of the rest of the world doesn't have that. And unless we defend it, we will lose it as well. In fact, when you think about the purpose of government biblically, what is it? Why do we even have government? The Bible tells us why we have government. Protect freedom, but even maybe a little bit more importantly, as Paul talks about in Romans, government is the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. In other words, the reason the government exists is to protect innocent people from evil. That's the main reason. That's the number one reason. There are other reasons, but that's the central reason. In fact, there's probably never been anything as pithy said about government than our founding father, James Madison, who's really the architect of the Constitution. He said this in Federalist 51. He said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Now, in recent months in the United States of America, we've seen what can happen when there's no government. When riots break out and nobody's there to quell the riot, you don't have peace and tranquility. You don't have security. You have chaos. That's why the government is necessary. The government is there to prevent anarchy and to ensure that innocent people do not get hurt, to ensure that rights are not trampled upon. In fact, our founding document, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men were created by their who? Or endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? If the government doesn't protect these rights, as the document goes on to say, then Jefferson and his cohort said, the people have a right to overthrow their government. Because if the government doesn't secure the rights, the government doesn't give you your rights, it just secures them. And if the government doesn't do that, Jefferson said, then the people have a right to get a new government. And that's what they did. So governments are instituted to protect innocent people from evil. And if people were inherently good, you wouldn't need government. But we need it because we're inherently evil. By the way, this is why socialism doesn't work. It's because it assumes people are inherently good. It's going to assume people are going to work as hard as possible and only take as little as they need, when in reality, people are not going to work very hard unless they have to in order to survive. And so that's why socialism doesn't work. If you don't have private property rights, people are not going to put forth the extra effort to actually be productive. I always ask people this: when was the last time you washed a rental car? You won't wash a rental car. Why? It's not yours. You don't care. If you can't enjoy the fruits of some of your labor, you're not going to be very motivated, are you? You know, William Bradford found that out when he came over with the Pilgrims, when he tried to just say, we're just going to do this in a communistic way. We're just going to have this big field and everyone's going to tend it, And they wound up not having enough food. What did he wind up doing to ensure that they did have enough food the next winter? He said, all right, this is your plot, this is your plot, this is your plot, this is your plot. Go out there and farm it. What you make, you keep. Everybody had enough food. Now, you say, well, you know, Christians haven't really had a good record of being involved in politics. I mean, look at our country. In fact, the reason our country is in trouble is because of the church. If you think about it, a number of years ago, I wrote a column. It's on our website, CrossExamined.org. I could have written it yesterday. I wrote it like 11 years ago. It says, country a mess, blame the church. Because we're the ones that haven't stood for righteousness and truth. We've backed down. We haven't been salt and light. And that's the reason the country is where it is. I'm not blaming people out there who disagree with us. They're just doing what they think's right. It's us that haven't lived up to being salt and light. We're the problem. And you say, well, but biblical characters, they didn't get involved in politics. Au contraire. They sure did. Every one of these people that you see up here either influenced governments and their political leaders or got involved somehow politically, from Joseph, Moses, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Nehemiah, Esther, Nahum, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, John the Baptist, Paul, and even Jesus himself. You say, wait a minute, Frank didn't say give to Caesar what is Caesar. It wasn't Jesus telling us not to get involved in politics at all? No, he wasn't saying that at all. We'll get to it a little bit later. Now, this isn't the Christian's number one priority, politics, but it's something that we need to be attentive to because it affects everything that we do, and it affects everything other people want to do. And if we want to love our neighbor, do we want to install a government more like South Korea or more like North Korea? South Korea, obviously. Now, whenever you say Christians ought to be involved in politics, and I think everybody ought to be involved in politics, you're going to get two major objections. What's the first one you're going to get? Separation of church and state. You're always going to hear that. Okay. We don't have time to go into all the nuance here with the separation of church and state. It turns out separation of church and state, as you know, is not in the First Amendment. It's not in the Constitution. It was a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Danbury Baptists who were worrying that the state was going to encroach on the church. And basically Jefferson said, no, there's a wall of separation between church and state. He meant he didn't want the state to get involved in the church. He didn't mean that the church couldn't influence the state, but that's beside the point anyway. This issue has nothing to do with the separation of church and state. It has nothing to do with setting up a theocracy. You'll hear people say that. Are you trying to set up a theocracy? No, we're not trying to establish a religion. We're not trying to tell people where, when, how, or if to worship. We're not saying you got to be a part of a certain denomination or a certain type of religious belief in order to be a Christian or in order to be a government employee or in order to be a citizen of the United States. We're not saying any of that. We're not trying to establish a religion, but we are trying to establish a morality. You see, nobody here is trying to establish a religion or legislate a religion, but we are legislating morality, and all laws legislate morality. You can't think of a law that doesn't legislate morality. Every law declares one behavior right and the opposite behavior wrong. The only question is, whose morality will we legislate? So when people say you can't impose your religion, say, I'm not trying to impose my religion. And what if they say, well, you're just trying to legislate principles in the Bible? Do you know thou shalt not murder's in the Bible? Does that mean we can't legislate that? Thou shalt not steal's in the Bible. Does that mean we can't have a law against stealing because it's in the Bible? That would be absurd, wouldn't it? In fact, when we legislate morality, we're not legislating it necessarily because it's in the Bible, even though it is in the Bible. We're legislating it because it's part of the natural law that God has given us. The natural law that says, you shall not murder, you shall not steal. That comes from God, the same source as the Bible. But we're not imposing a religion, we're imposing morality. And everybody imposes some sort of moral position. On every issue, you're saying this is morally right and this is morally wrong. Now, if you say, okay, I know it's not a separation of church and state issue, we're not trying to legislate a religion, but you are trying to legislate a morality, well, don't impose your morality on me. You'll get that too, right? That's the next objection you're always going to get. Now, when people say, don't impose your morality on me, what can you say back to them? Yeah, then why are you imposing your morality on me? Notice what they're saying is, you ought not impose ought nots. And that's their moral position. And they're imposing it on you to say you ought not impose ought nots. So they're doing exactly what they claim you can't do. And in fact, it's just a self-defeating proposition. Actually, I think a better answer to this is when people say, don't impose your morality on me, I say, this isn't my morality. I didn't make this stuff up. I didn't make up the fact that murder's wrong, that theft is wrong, that abortion's wrong, that rape is wrong, that men were made for women and women were made for men. And the best way to perpetuate and stabilize society, which is the reason the government's involved in marriage to begin with, is to legally recognize that man-woman relationship over every other relationship. I didn't make any of this stuff up. This isn't my morality. This isn't your morality. This just happens to be the morality. The one that Thomas Jefferson said was self-evident. The one that the Apostle Paul said the Gentiles are not of the law, have the law written on their hearts in Romans chapter 2. Everybody already knows this is right and other things are wrong. Now, if you have a problem with the morality, you really don't have a problem with me. You have a problem with the Creator upon whose nature this morality is derived. So if you've got a problem, you've got a problem with the Creator, not me. This isn't my morality. I didn't make any of this stuff up. I'm just simply saying, let's recognize what's really right and true and put that appropriately on the big issues into law. Because if we don't do that, we're going to have chaos. Does that make sense? All right, so the first objection then, should Christians be involved in politics? The answer is, of course they should. If they weren't involved, then it's bad for everyone. It's bad for Christians, it's bad for non-Christians, and it even affects our ability to spread the gospel and live the gospel. The next question is, what are the most important issues? And at this point, you sometimes hear people saying, well, you know, all the issues are about equally the same. I mean, aren't all sins the same? Aren't all sins equal? Okay, let's suppose that you are in Nazi Germany during World War II and you're hiding Jews in your attic. And you get a knock on your door. Schnell! 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 Come to the door, open the door. SS is there. Hast du hier Juden? What do you do? Are you going to lie? Thou shalt not bear false witness. What are you going to do? Hast du hier Juden? Schnell! Yeah, actually, we've got 4 of them up in the attic, and if you only see 3, make sure you keep looking because there's another one up there. Is that what you're not supposed to lie, right? What are you going to do? Say nothing? 9, you're going to lie? A little white lie. Really? A little bit of a dilemma here, isn't it? Well, let me ask you a question. Are all sins the same? Are all moral issues the same? Well, let's see what Jesus said. Because I hear this all the time. All sins are the same. It is true that all sin separates you from God, but that doesn't mean all sin is the same and has the same consequences. In fact, Jesus taught on this extensively. First of all, he's asked, as you know, what is the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commands. If there's a greatest command, then there must be a command that isn't quite as great. There must be another command that maybe isn't quite as great as that. In other words, there's some sort of hierarchy here. not only are there greater and lesser commands, there's greater love. In fact, Christianity is built on greater love. Jesus says this in John 15, "My command is this, love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." In other words, Jesus is saying, you want to love? This is my command. I give you a new command. Love one another as I have loved you. How did he love us? He went to the cross to pay our own punishment. He went and took it upon himself. What was due me and due you, he took on himself. That's greater love. And by the way, this is why love does not require approval. We may have talked about that before in here. Love doesn't require approval. In fact, if you truly love someone, you will stand in their way if they want to do evil. They won't approve of it, but you'll stand in their way. You know what love requires? It requires sacrifice. That you have to put your own self-interest sometimes aside in order to love somebody else, in order to seek what's really good for somebody else. That's what Jesus did. Not only is there a greatest commandment and greater love, there's also greater sin. Jesus is before Pilate. And Pilate is flustered with Jesus because he won't really answer his questions. And at one point, Pilate says, "Don't you realize I have the power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." Hold that thought for just a second. Not given to you from above. Jesus is admitting that the government has authority to mete out capital punishment. Now, capital punishment is different than, say, taking the life of an unborn child. Why? Because taking the life of an unborn child, the unborn child is innocent. In capital punishment, in most cases we hope, in all cases we hope, when you're taking somebody's life, it's because they're guilty. But Jesus is admitting that the government has the authority to do that, which is originally put forth in Genesis chapter 9, that the government has authority to pay life for life. Anyway, here's what Jesus says right after that. "Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Who handed Jesus over to Pilate? Some say he might be talking about Judas, but he's probably here talking about Caiaphas, the high priest who handed him on over to Pilate and said, "Crucify him." Caiaphas had the greater sin. Not only is there the greatest commandment, greater love, greater sin, there's also, you might imagine, greater judgment. Now, Jesus in this case is talking about judging of particular towns in Israel, some who saw his miracles and didn't repent. Here's what he says. "Woe to you, Chorazin," that's a town not far from the Sea of Galilee. "Woe to you, Bethsaida," another town near the Sea of Galilee. "If the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for you." Wow. In other words, to whom much is given, much will be required, which is the next point he makes in another context. Greater knowledge equals greater punishment. Jesus is telling a parable here about two people who are serving, and they have different responses to when the master is coming back to the house. And here's what he says, and this is really, basically, he's saying, I'm going to come again. You better be ready when I come again. And here's how he puts it toward the end of the parable. "The servant who knows the master's will and does not get ready or does not do what the master wants will be beaten with many blows. But the one who does not know and does things deserving punishment will be beaten with fewer blows." And here's what we always hear. "From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded or required. And from the one who has been entrusted with much more will be asked." Now, in America, we have more knowledge right now about God than any generation in history. In fact, I know this is going to sound like almost blasphemous, but do you know we have more revelation from God than Paul had. Paul never read the book of Revelation. Paul might not have seen some of Peter's letters. Paul may not have known everything that was going into the New Testament. He may have never even seen the book of Hebrews. And now, in America, in this day and age, with the kind of programs and search tools and internet that we have, there's no excuse for not knowing God and making him known. This is one of the scariest verses in the entire Bible for me. To whom much is given, much will be required. And it makes sense, right? Greater knowledge, from a justice perspective, if you're doing something wrong, should give a greater punishment. Not only do we have the greatest commandment, greater love, greatest sin, greater judgment, and greater punishment, Jesus even went after politicians himself. Who were the politicians in his day? The Pharisees, right? You say, well, they're the religious leaders. Yes, but they were also the political leaders. Some of them were on the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, kind of their Supreme Court, because Rome delegated most of the day-to-day political activity to this body, this Supreme Court. And they were on this court, so they made judgments. They enforced the law. These were the politicians. And what did Jesus say to them in Matthew chapter 23? By the way, if you think Jesus was always a sweet guy, you have not read Matthew chapter 23. He goes after these people. Here's just 2 verses. He says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel." This little bit of humor at the end there, right? What they were doing, they were straining their water to make sure they wouldn't eat bugs or drink bugs when they had their water. He's saying, you're straining out gnats, but you're swallowing a whole camel, the biggest animal in the Middle East that was an unclean animal. You're swallowing the whole thing because you're majoring in the minors. You are tithing your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Now, what do you think Jesus would say to our politicians today who are telling us what light bulbs we can and can't use, but they won't say, don't murder your children? Are we neglecting the weightier matters of the law? Yeah, I think we are. Jesus went after these people. Now, if there's more important matters of the law, what does that mean? There must be lesser important matters of the law, right? In other words, when you put all this together, when you put the greatest commandment, greater love, greater sin, greater judgment, greater knowledge equals greater punishment, and more important matters of the law, what are you getting? You're getting what is known as a moral hierarchy. That some things are more important than others. So when the Nazis come to your door, you lie. Because you have a greater duty to protect innocent life than you do to tell the truth to a guilty murderer. This is called in ethics graded absolutism. That you have a greater duty to obey that higher command and you're exempted from the lower command. You're not sinning by not adhering to the lower command. You're exempted from that command in order to obey the higher command. And by the way, this is in the scriptures. What did the Hebrew midwives do with Moses? Pharaoh wanted to kill all the babies. What do the Hebrew midwives do in order to save Moses? They lie to the Pharaoh. Oh, these Hebrew ladies, they just give birth so fast, we didn't even know he was born. You know, they make up some kind of lie. Rahab, she lies in order to save the spies in Jericho. Right? There are examples of doing this in order to obey the higher command. Now, I'm not saying it's okay to lie all the time. Don't get me wrong. I'm saying if you're in this kind of dilemma, you have the higher absolute that you need to obey. You're exempted from the lower absolute. So, there are higher and lower laws, higher and lower responsibilities, higher and lower duties. And this just makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, think of our own justice system. Okay, if you murder somebody, you're going to go to prison a lot longer than if you steal a loaf of bread, right? at least you hope, that would be what's fair, right, and just. So when people say all sin is the same, you can say, no, that's not what Jesus taught. That's not what the apostles taught. All sin separates you from God, but not all sin is the same, and not all punishment is the same. In fact, I don't have time to get into this now, but there's going to be different levels of punishment in hell, and there's going to be different levels of reward in heaven. We don't have time to go into the scriptures here, but we're not going to have complete equality in heaven either. Did you know that? People always say, everything's got to be equal. No, not even in heaven it's going to be equal. Why? Because the Apostle Paul is going to earn a lot more rewards than any of us, and deservedly so. Now, we're not going to have the sin nature. We're not going to be jealous of the Apostle Paul. We're going to say, hey, he deserves it. It's just, it's right, it's fair. So, with that being said, the next question is, does abortion trump everything else in this country? Well, we've already seen what's in the womb. And you know, the Bible knew this centuries ago. You knit me together in my mother's womb. But probably one of the clearest passages on this, it's not really talking about abortion, but it's telling you what's in the womb, is when Mary goes to visit Elizabeth. Who's Mary pregnant with? Jesus. Who's Elizabeth pregnant with? John the Baptist. They're cousins. And Mary goes and she visits Elizabeth. And look what happens. This is in Luke chapter 1. At that time, Mary got ready and hurried to a town in the hill country of Judea, where she entered Zachariah's home and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the choice, the blob of tissue, the fetus, no, the baby leapt in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. Now, she's about 6 months pregnant at this point. The Bible is referring to John the Baptist in the womb as a baby. That's what's in the womb. And look, everybody knows this. Everybody already knows this. You have to be thoroughly propagandized to not know what's in a pregnant woman's womb. There's not a squirrel in there. Okay, there's not a blob of tissue. There's a baby in there. Now, how many people in here have seen Saving Private Ryan? How many have seen Hacksaw Ridge? How many have seen Schindler's List? How many have seen The Passion of the Christ? I'm sure people watching have seen the same. Now, you knew when you were going to go in there, you were going to see some brutal imagery, right? And you actually paid to go see this brutal imagery, because you knew that it was the truth, and you also knew that some things can't be described as well as they can be witnessed. So what I want to show you now is a short 55-second video. And in this video, you're going to see several stages of an abortion. Very early, a little bit later, and then all the way at 24 weeks. So if anyone's watching at home, you have young children, I'm just going to say right now that this is at least PG-13. You may want to look away for about a minute once we start playing this video. And I also want to say that if there's anybody out there that's had an abortion, this is not meant to condemn anybody. There's forgiveness in Christ. That's why Christ came. He came to die and pay the punishment for all of our sins. So you can put anything that you've done under the foot of the cross. And if anyone in here has encouraged an abortion, the same thing. All of us have sinned and fall short of the glory of God in some way. Some of us in greater ways than others, but all sin can be forgiven by Christ. So I just want to show you this video because the images will tell the truth rather than just me standing up here and saying, here's the science of embryology. Every embryologist knows that from the moment of conception, there's a new living human being. But too often we don't want to believe it. So what we're going to do is we're going to be correct, not politically correct. This is a hard video to watch, but we need to watch it. There is no narration, just music, So for those of you that don't want to watch it, you'll just hear music. Here we go. Here we go. Greater knowledge yields greater responsibility and greater punishment if we don't do anything about it. There are a lot of people out there, politically, are saying, this is a woman's right. This is a choice. If they've seen a video like this, you know what Jesus would say to them? The same thing he said to the other politicians of his day. Here's what he said. You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desire. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. Now, if somebody watches that video, or somebody actually sees an abortion, and they're still saying it's just a choice, this is what I think Jesus would say to them. Because it's a lie. And they know it's a lie. Again, most people haven't seen that. So it's our job to try and demonstrate to them that this is a grave injustice. You understand, I'm not saying that all politicians who are pro-choice, so to speak, are Satanists or demonic. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is if you know the truth and you're still promoting this, then this does apply to you. Now, what about some other pro-life issues? Because there are other pro-life issues, and Christians ought to be concerned with every one of these. We ought to be concerned to alleviate poverty. We ought to try and get people affordable health care. We also want to protect the environment. And then we're supposed to all fight racism as well. Now, these are all important issues. And I don't have time to get into detail on all of these. I spent a lot more time on our podcast talking about these issues. I'm just going to say a minute or two on each, but if you want to go into more depth on them, check out our podcast from August 21st. 2020, does abortion trump everything else? Spent 50 minutes on this topic. I don't have time to get into it all here, but let me just say a few words. Every one of these issues, it should be important to Christians. But Christians and non-Christians, most of us actually agree on the ends. What do we disagree on is the means. In other words, most people, they want to alleviate poverty. They want affordable health care. They want to protect. Who wants to live in a dirty place? Nobody does. They want to fight racism. The question is, how do we do these things? This is where the disagreement comes in. I think both major political parties in the United States want to do all these things. I think they just disagree on how to do it. And there's legitimate debate. For example, how do you alleviate poverty? And about abortion versus poverty. What's the bigger issue here? They're both important. But let me ask you this question. Is failing to give money to a poor person just as bad as murdering a poor person? No, of course not. And if you're saying they're equal, I don't think you're really sure about what are the most important matters of law. We could even put it another way. Is having a different government plan to assist the poor just as bad as using government funds to murder the poor? Because right now, and I'm just telling you the truth, you get to do what you want with this information, the Democrat Party wants to use taxpayer money to fund what you just saw in that video. They want to use taxpayer money for abortion. They are. Yes, they are in certain, but they want to get rid of what's known as the Hyde Amendment, which prevents that. In fact, I submit to you, you are neglecting the more important matters of the law if you think that your anti-poverty plan is more important than the murder of 1 million innocent babies each year, because that's what's going on in America. There's about 1 million abortions every year. Now, I'm not saying all women that have abortions are murderers, because most of them don't even know what they're doing in that regard. They haven't seen this video. They've been bought into the propaganda that this is just a choice, just a blob of tissue. But it's not. How about abortion versus the environment? You know, it's typically talked about this way, that climate change is such a big deal. Not only do we might have a ends and means disagreement here, there's another distinction that needs to be made. We have a disagreement over facts. Is it really true that human beings in recent decades are emitting so much CO2 that they're affecting climate change? And there is a big dispute over that. I'll say there's a consensus. Well, maybe a majority of scientists think it's so. But there's other people who are saying, no, it's not so. I have one question for people who say it's definitely so. Why did we have ice ages and warm ages long before apparently even human beings were on the earth? I mean, the climate's been changing forever. Are we really affecting the climate with our CO2 emissions? Maybe we are. Maybe we're not. Let's suppose for the sake of argument we are. Do you know that if the United States reduced its CO2 to 0, it would have virtually no effect on global temperatures? In fact, a number of years ago, I was out in Geneva, Switzerland. I was visiting a cousin of mine through marriage. He works for the UN in Geneva. And we got talking about climate change. And he said, Frank, don't you think you guys ought to reduce global emissions? I said, if we reduce global emissions to 0, it will not impact global temperatures at all, even if human beings are affecting climate change, because countries, developing countries like India and China, they are not going to reduce at all. And he looked at me and he said, you know what? You're right. We could go to 0. It wouldn't matter. Not only that, what is often forgotten about this is that when we're emitting CO2, why are we emitting CO2? Because we're trying to be productive. If you're going to reduce CO2 dramatically, you're going to increase poverty dramatically, because you're going to take away jobs from people. Now you're trying to solve one problem, you're creating another problem. People don't realize there's a ripple effect here. Do you remember years ago there was something called DDT, which killed mosquitoes? But we also thought it might cause cancer, so we banned DDT. What happened? A lot more people died from malaria than would have died from cancer, because we weren't systematically thinking about this. There are always trade-offs, or frequently trade-offs in public policy. You reduce emissions too much, people lose jobs, poverty occurs. You reduce DDT use, malaria pops up, and people die from that rather than any more than they would have died from, much more than they would have died from cancer. So there's always trade-offs here. And my point is this, that you are neglecting the more important matters of law if you think that your climate change plan is more important than the murder of 1 million innocent babies each year. How about health care? You hear this quite a bit. Doesn't everybody want affordable, quality, and universal health care? Guess what? Getting all three of those is virtually impossible. Ben Shapiro has talked about this quite a bit. 3 aspects of healthcare. It could be affordable, high quality, and universal. You can have 2 of those 3, but not all 3. By the way, our system here, everybody already has healthcare. They don't have health insurance. Anybody can go to an emergency room and get treated. It's the law. They don't have health insurance. So we already have healthcare. but we don't have health insurance. By the way, what does our for-profit system do for the world? It drives innovation, which makes the quality of healthcare better for everyone. You say, well, other countries have socialist systems, universal systems. Yeah, but where are they getting all their innovation from? Or most of it? From us. If you kill the profit motive in the United States of America, you are going to make the entire world less healthy. Because nobody's going to be doing, or at least fewer people are going to be doing the innovation that drives better healthcare. How many people do you know that go to Canada for a surgery? Or go to Britain for some kind of treatment? No, they all come here. Why? Because we have the best healthcare system in the world. It's too expensive. Why? Because government gets too involved. When Obamacare came in, you know, I'm self-employed. When Obamacare came in, for years I had Blue Cross Blue Shield individual coverage. For my wife and I, it was $1,200 a year. As soon as Obamacare came in, it doubled to $2,400. $2,400. But guess what? Because due to Obamacare, we had maternity coverage. We were 55 years old. What do we need maternity coverage for? We don't. But the government mandated it for everybody, which means the price went up and I couldn't afford it. So now I'm with Christian Healthcare Ministries. We pay $350 a month. Anything up to $500 we pay for. Anything north of $500, they get involved. Maybe you ought to check into it. I'm not going to pay $2,400 a month. Can't afford that. So when you get the government too involved, the cost goes way up. Now, I'm not trying to make light of this issue. This is a hard issue. Nobody has all the answers on this. I'm simply saying this, that you are neglecting the more important matters of the law if you think your health care plan is more important than the murder of 1 million innocent babies a year. Finally, the hardest issue of all these, in my view, is racism. But I do have a question. We see a lot of protests out there, and as you know, we've been talking about this for months in the United States, rightfully so. Here's my question. What legislation will alleviate racism? You could have asked that question 50 years ago, before the civil rights legislation. And quite obviously, this country has had a horrible record on racism. In fact, most countries have. It's not just unique to us, right? But are laws unjust right now? I keep hearing people talking about systematic racism. I haven't heard anybody identify what that means. Because if there is a law out there that's racist, we ought to change it. I agree. I think the better question, though, is this. What legislation will improve opportunities for minorities that's fair to everyone? And I can give you 2 or 3 ideas right now. School choice. Because right now, look, it's not meant to be racist that minority children are in bad schools. It's not meant to be racist, but it turns out to affect minorities in a negative way. So how could we make it better or easier for minorities to be in better schools? What could we do? We could give the parents the money so the parents could send their kids to whatever school they want. We could have school choice, charter, whatever it is. And as you know, for those of you that have followed this, Black Lives Matter, of course, all Black Lives Matter, every life matters. But Black Lives Matter, the organization, is a Marxist organization. If you look at their website, they want everything that's anti-biblical. I don't have time to get into it. Just go read it. But the biggest thing we could do to alleviate bad outcomes for minorities is what this man, Walt Blackman, who's in the Arizona State House, wrote back in February. And he's using stats from 2011. Those are the most current stats he had. Here's what he said. According to the Guttmacher Institute, which generally supports abortion, in 2011, 360,000 black babies were aborted. CDC statistics for 2011 show that 287,072 black deaths occurred from all other causes excluding abortion. By these numbers, abortion is the leading cause of death among blacks. The leading cause of death among blacks is abortion. Abortion kills more blacks than any sort of racism could ever do. In fact, 75% of abortions in America are to poor people near the poverty line. And despite the fact that blacks make up 13% of the population, 38% of the abortions are to black babies. Don't defund the police, defund Planned Parenthood. So let's sum all this up by looking at the 2 major party platforms on some major issues. Democrat, Republican. By the way, this is not just about Trump and Biden. Okay, it is, but it's also about the 435 representatives that are elected every 2 years in the United States of America. There's always about 33 or 34 senators up. There's several governors and many local elections every November. And 90% of the people who are part of these parties vote with their party. 90% of the time, let me put it that way. 90% of the time, Democrats vote with the Democratic platform, Republicans vote with the Republican platform. Okay? Here's the data. Abortion, Democrats want to pay for it, Republicans want to ban it or at least restrict it. Religious freedom, restricted. What do I mean by that? Well, notice some of these blue state governors are allowing casinos to open, but not churches. They don't think church is really a right or religion is really a right. And when it comes to the LGBTQ issue, if there's ever a conflict between religious rights and LGBTQ, guess who wins? LGBTQ. It is in their platform. You can read it. They talk about exemptions for religious organizations. Say no. You can't discriminate, yet they're discriminating against religious people. Of course, Republicans believe it's unrestricted. Judges, these are lawmaking judges. Whereas the Republicans are trying to put law-applying judges on there. What does that mean? Instead of making law, like they just apply the law that the people have passed. That's why there's a war going on whenever there's a new Supreme Court justice like we have right now. Because the left knows that the best way to get their agenda through is by judges who just declare it by fiat, where 5 unelected justices can tell the rest of the country what to do, even if the country decided opposite that. Now, it's true that sometimes Republican judges turn out to be these kind of judges, but I've never seen a case where one of these judges turns out to be this kind of judge. How about race-neutral policies? I know this is going to sound crazy, but it's in the Democrat platform. You can read it. They do not believe in race-neutral policies. In other words, they want to use race to advantage people or use policy to advantage certain races over others. Whereas, of course, the Republicans are against that. School choice, the one great idea that could help minorities, they're against. Republicans are for. They want to decrease military spending. Republicans are for it. Now, I'm not here to say that all Republicans are good because they're not. I'm not here to say all Democrats are bad because they're not. What I'm here to say is that these are their platforms, and 90% of the time, they vote with their platform. So, does Jesus trump your politics? Here's the bottom line. Being pro-life doesn't necessarily qualify someone as a good candidate, but being pro-abortion necessarily disqualifies someone as a good candidate. You can be pro-life and be terrible on everything else. That doesn't mean you're a good candidate. But if you're pro-abortion, I think that you are majoring in the minors, that you are neglecting the more important matters of the law. In fact, anyone know what this is? This is Molech. This is the god, idol god, a metal god, that the Israelites were sacrificing their children to. This was a Canaanite idol. And they'd heat this thing up in fire, and they would put their children on the arms of this molten hot metal idol known as Molech. The Bible talks about not doing this quite obviously in Leviticus 18, a couple other places, and in Jeremiah. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. When is Jeremiah writing? Jeremiah is writing about the time the exile is going to occur, when Babylon is going to come in and wipe out Jerusalem and take the Israelites to Babylon in exile. And here's what Jeremiah writes. He gets this from God. These people are sacrificing their children to Molech. Here's what happens. The people of Judah have sinned before my very eyes, says the Lord. They have set up their abominable idols right in the temple that bears my name, defiling it. They have built pagan shrines at Topeth, the garbage dump in the valley of Ben Hinnom, which is just to the south of the city of David. I've been there several times. And there they burn their sons and daughters in the fire. I have never commanded such a horrible deed. It never even crossed my mind to command such a thing. God would never want child sacrifice for the Israelites to do that. Then he goes on to say this, here are the consequences. So beware, for the time is coming, says the Lord, when that garbage dump will no longer be called Topeth or the valley of Ben Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. They will bury their bodies in Topeth until there is no more room for them. The bodies of my people will be food for the vultures and wild animals, and no one will be left to scare them away. I will put an end to the happy singing and laughter in the streets of Jerusalem. The joyful voices of the bridegrooms and brides will no longer be heard in the towns of Judah. The land will lie in complete desolation. God's own people. Solomon started this about 350 years prior to the judgment. He was burning children to Molech. How much longer does America have doing this? Is he going to end our country soon? Either from within, eternal riot, civil war, external force? I have no idea. I'm just saying that this is what God thinks about sacrificing your children on the altar of convenience. So does abortion trump everything else? Yeah, I think it does. How can it not? The active murder of individuals, innocent human beings? We're going to put up with that?